I'm very pleased to welcome you to tonight's program with Enrique Martínez Celaya and Alexander Nemerov. I also extend a warm welcome on this chilly, rainy day on behalf of our Vice President for the Arts, Deborah Cullinan, who had planned to be here and unfortunately is caught in some travel delays returning from the East Coast. So I will briefly introduce our guests and then we will dive right into the conversation. So Enrique Martínez Celaya is an artist, author, and former physicist whose work has been exhibited and collected by major institutions worldwide. He's Provost Professor of Humanities and Arts at the University of Southern California and a Montgomery Fellow at Dartmouth College. Martínez Celaya was born in Cuba and raised in Spain and Puerto Rico. He initiated his formal artistic training as an apprentice to a painter at the age of 12 and studied applied physics, literature, and art at Cornell University, the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of California, Santa Barbara. His work is held in 58 public collections internationally, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and the Whitney Museum of American Art. He is the author of 9 books, and his work has been the subject of 14 monographic publications. He is also the founder of Whale and Star, an evolving idea of social interaction and responsibility, whose imprint is internationally recognized for its books in art, poetry, art practice, and critical theory. And Alexander Nemerov is an art historian and author. He is a Carl and Marilyn Thoma Provostial Professor in the Arts and Humanities here at Stanford. I know many of you know him, where he began in 2012 after teaching at Yale for 11 years. Nemerov is the author of many books, including The Forest, A Fable of America in the 1830s, published last year, and called by the novelist Annie Proulx one of the richest books ever to come my way. He is also the author of Fierce Poise, Helen Frankenthaler, and 1950s New York, described by Susan Stomberg of NPR as lyrical and powerful, and that work was finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Biography in 2021. And with that, I will invite our guests to come forward and hand it to you, Alex.
All right, Anne, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Trust you can hear me and eventually us. Okay, it's my pleasure to be here with Enrique, who is, we've talked only a few times, but I consider you to be my dear friend. Even if I didn't know you, I'd say you were my dear friend based on your work, which leads me to the following point that I encountered Enrique's work for the first time in 2019 at his studio then in Culver City, and I walked into the studio and I was, I don't think I'd ever been so moved looking at paintings, certainly not paintings that, were, had been made that year even. I mean, I was astounded by the direct emotional appeal of these works, and I think ever since then we've been in a dialogue, and your work has helped me with my own and moved me and shaped me, and I'm so glad you could be here. A lot of your works have to do with, at least the ones I saw that day, have to do often with figures who are right up at the front of the picture plane and who are engaging us plaintively, directly, but without any evident indication of how we should be or what we should think. Could you maybe say something about those figures of directness?
First, thank you very much for inviting me and for you to be here. So your question, so my work was originally traditional figurative painting when I was an apprentice. And one of the problems that I encountered over the years while making those paintings is that there was a certain amount of falsehood I felt. The more realistic the paintings became, the more theatrical they became. And that theatricality became one of the problems that I found in painting. So in trying to resolve the problem of practicality, I began to work with these two forces that I call presence and reference. People have used those names before. And to solve that problem of theatricality using presence and reference is that I began to manipulate the way the experience of the paintings occurred. And some of that is that frontality. The paintings are mostly centrally composed. They have no arrangement. They are sort of very large icons in some manner. And they share with icons that sense of immediacy and otherworldliness in the sense that they don't quite belong to a world in the sense of traditional, the traditional paintings I used to make.
Yes, there'll be like a figure, we're starting to see these on a slow loop, but, a figure, a child, mostly naked next to ice, a kind of Arctic ice block or something like that, or a young girl with her foot on a dead shark at the side of the ocean on the beach, with beautiful enigmatic waves and clouds indicating a larger world, or a dock, a broken down, ruined dock. You'll notice in just the things I'm talking about, children come up a lot in your work. So these figures, I don't know if you want to say something about presence and reference with these figures, but maybe the figures have to do with being present to us immediately, like they were for me that day in your studio, but also they're referring to things. But then children in particular seem to have this poignant but unsentimental presence in your work.
I'm going to try to say something about this part, and whenever I try, it gets boring quickly. So I'm going to try to do the short version of it. But and it's something very hard to see in reproductions. You have to sort of be standing in front of the painting and interacting with it. In the same way that if you look at a picture of a person, the experience you get of that person is very different than when you're standing next to them. So I am somebody who is partly an intellectual that refuses to have that manifested in the work. And so I always believe this seems like I'm going around in the Dante way around the forest to get, but I am very interested in the idea of intelligence using itself to get out of the way, right, and put itself in the forefront of it. So when accounting for that, when trying to do something that doesn't, where intellectual work is not a veil through which you have to see the work, but rather a mechanism of revelation in the work. When you account for that, and then you account for the necessity that the reference doesn't take you away from where you are, as sometimes paintings, you might see, an angel and your mind goes somewhere with that. I'm very interested in your mind trying to go somewhere and some parts of the painting demanding that you stay where you are, physically and viscerally. And in trying to resolve that, it's almost like resolving an equation that if things work right, and they often don't, and that's why I paint and repaint, then the revelation offered by intellectual probing and the viscerality and physical presence of the painting and the reference all hold themselves together in some sort of poetic equation that doesn't work often, but occasionally seems to work. And that's the experience that I'm after.
So poetic equation might be in the form of, again, say the look on the face of one of these children in your pictures, or the poetic equation between non sequitur things that somehow rhyme and make a kind of emotional sense. I mentioned the child in the ice block, but it could be another girl I can think of with a like leopard over her shoulders, and so many other works, a large, almost kind of molten angel in one picture. And then you also include writing in your paintings, often drawn from the poetry that you admire, T.S. Eliot, Robert Frost, people like that. But this is the kind of, example of the way intelligence uses itself to get out of the way. And I imagine you yourself are, this is how I imagine it, are not sure what it is you've made or what it quote unquote means, but you feel you're in the presence of something that's emotionally truthful to your whole prospect and business as an artist.
Yeah, that's a very good point you make, an important one that I almost never get to mention, but you just brought it out, and I think that's very important. So any painting that I understand how it works, that I can figure out how is it that it comes together, I paint over.
Yeah.
So at the end, the paintings that survive are the paintings, as you said, that are working, although I don't really understand why.
Yes.
So then I am captivated by them, and something is revealed, something is opened by those paintings, and I can think my way through them. So they're not programmatic paintings. I think a lot of, especially in didactic paintings, of which there are many, they have a program that you look at the painting and within a few minutes you know what the program is. And then you don't need to look at them anymore. You just know the program. So for me, I want a painting that survived that scrutiny.
Yeah, and it seems like, though you don't have a program at all, you are, in my opinion, a protean artist. It seems like, I'm sure it's much more difficult than what it appears to me, but it seems as though these motifs or these vast images that you give us are just appear one after another in your work, seemingly without end. Is that the way you experience it, that you're onto something infinite?
No, I often feel like my last show, that was it. I
Really?
run out.
Yeah.
Every time I think like I got lucky somehow to finish that show. And then when I have a schedule like I have now of many shows to come, I am both confident to the extent that I have done it before, so I suspect I probably will, but I have no idea how.
Yeah, you have this show coming up in Puerto Rico in 2 weeks is the open. Cuba, I'm sorry, and then you have this show in New York City in April. And you've had to produce these massive works, so maybe I'm a little bit enthralled of that, but it seems like every time I'm at your studio there are comparable kinds of pictures. Yeah. But the thing that pleases you and satisfies you, it's not, how to say it, it is personal, but it's not personal. Maybe you could speak to that, because I suspect people sometimes look at your work and think of it as very autobiographical, which how could it not be? But at the same time, I'm guessing you would resist the idea that it's quote unquote about you.
Absolutely. I think that often they have a point of departure that has some connection to my biography, especially these two upcoming exhibitions. But it's never about me. That's a point of departure, but not of arrival. I'm not so interested in my biography or sharing memories with you or anything like that. It is trying to get us something through the deeply subjective until that subjectivity disappears out of the work.
Yeah.
So, for instance, if you look at right now this exhibition I'm doing at the National Museum in Cuba, is personal. The event is very personal because I'm coming back as as the first exile that they allowed to come to the museum to do a show. So that's very problematic for my family. It's very problematic. It's strange to do a show that your entire family doesn't want you to do. So then I'm doing the show in New York, which you mentioned, that's using letters of my childhood in Cuba. So it's connected in that way. But then the show after that at the Hood Art Museum at Dartmouth is looking at Robert Frost's his relationship with his son. And even though it may seem so separate from his preoccupations of my own biography, in fact, in some ways, I feel much more personally connected to this circumstance of Frost and his son Carol than I do to the source of my work for the Cuban.
Yeah, I often feel more, how to say it, like more emotionally invested in people, not my immediate family, like my daughters and my wife, but overall, like more emotionally invested in people who are not related to me than people who are related to me when I think about subjects of my writing. So I think I understand that. Isn't there a photograph of Frost and his son, who later killed himself, in your studio? I think I saw that. So maybe you could say a little bit more about that. Why the connection to Frost and his son?
So, for example, in the works from Cuba and New York, even though those points of departures are poignant and very significant to me, I already have lived the answer in some ways. But the relationship between Frost and that picture you talk about, where he's with his young son Carol, and then what happened in Carol's life, and after Carol committed suicide, Robert Frost wrote to his grandson a line that he said that I tried many times with him, and what I would do to try once more. And even though it's so easy to say it in language, that sentence is, any of us can write it. It is impossible to try to understand what it's trying to hold together in those words. And the impossibility of, sometimes we mention something so casually, like Carol shot himself with a rifle. Well, that's an easy statement to make. But what it points to is an abyss. It's an entire world. So the mystery of that photograph, the mystery of that relationship, is to me less known than my own history. But at the same time, as somebody who has 4 children, is a question mark. It is a warning.
Yeah, so that idea of art as something, a single line, let's say, as something that holds within itself and a kind of energy that even the poet or the writer cannot contain, or it's an explosive energy, but it's presented with an economy of means. Do you feel that applies to your work?
It's interesting because this is an older painting that does relate to Frost, so it's kind of interesting we have.
How so?
It's called Marjorie the Companion, who is one of Frost's children, and of course there's no Marjorie in it, but it's based on the landscape on Frost's farm in New Hampshire, the original one, first one. So what was?
Well, it's to do with emotion as being contained in a simple line that any one of us could write, you say, but, and I'm interested in how emotionally raw and vulnerable your pictures are, but they're not presented as, I don't know, the emotion is withheld in these poignant, kind of reserved figures I mentioned.
We were talking before we came in here about your book. My sense that your book, The Forest, is deeply emotional, but I find it to be emotion under compression. There's a certain they're no sentimental and they're no bombastic or pedantic. And I find this very difficult to do. I don't encounter it very often, except in some of the writers who I admire the most. I think we tend to hear a lot about some territory that is outlined for us between sentimentality. When people say they want their work not to be sentimental, quite often emotion goes away with it. This sort of,
Yeah.
it's very easy to have a work that is non-sentimental if you remove any claims to emotion from it and any personal investment in it. And I think that I am very interested in people who are at the edge, at that edge where if you go a little bit this way, the work is terrible and sentimental. And if you go a little bit this way, the work seems to be too cool. Or,
Yeah.
And I think, for example, like if in comparing, say, Rembrandt to Velázquez, two contemporaries, I tend to prefer the emotional compression of Velázquez to the emotional exuberance of Rembrandt. So this is not easy to do in anything, but it's certainly not easy to do in painting, because at the end of the day, painting commits you to something in a very, in a way that, for me at least, sometimes words allow you a little bit more leeway. But painting demands a certain precision that sometimes words can elude.
Yeah. Well, staying with emotion, I mean, do you accept that there's a wellspring in it, in, for example, you or any other serious creative person? Like it comes from a deep place, and I guess I'm coming back to childhood again, or is that a romantic view of things? And like what can you think a little bit about deep bases for what comes out in your canvas, or is that just kind of an art historical question?
The source of this, of emotion, of the emotion that you're referring to, which is different than day-to-day emotion, is a mystery. And I say that not trying to be cute. I say that in a sense, there are times that when there's deep emotion and you feel the resonance of it in the work, it seems to have no authorship. It seems to be no, I created this. So, but rather, and this is something that is hard for me to kind of say because I am not sort of a touchy-feely artist, but sometimes you feel almost as if you're a vehicle for something in that moment. And I have asked many times, what is this feeling? And I think that the painting is opening a territory, is opening a conversation that in the dialogue between the painting, me and the painting, something emerges from some spring, from some source that I, in my day-to-day life, have no access to in a conventional sense. So it's almost like the person who paints is not the person who lives. Like me sitting here is not the person who made the paintings. And that's a I think, a very accurate statement, but it sounds charming, even though I don't want to sound charming.
How do you, I've always wanted to ask you this, I mean, how do you balance the sort of depthful, rigorous, inward soul who makes the pictures and who, as you're saying right now, is not even you exactly within this other person who is, you know, at the openings for these shows and so on? How do you balance between the two, or is that really not even a good question? I mean, it's just something that one does. One comes up from underwater and then it's another element and one does that, you know, behaves as the artist and, you know, engages with the so-called art world and all of that.
I think the answer to that is childhood. I think my own childhood of dislocation and disassociation, and a childhood that I learned very early on that the survival of some parts of myself depended on being kept away from the dynamics of living. And then
Dynamics of living, like just the threats of existence, the externality, the cold externality of ordinary life.
Ordinary life, and sometimes, for instance, I give you a very charged example. When we were leaving from Cuba to Spain, we were in this Iberia plane. It's the first plane I've ever been, I mean, I've seen one plane before, my father's plane when he left, but my mother was crying and my brother were crying because it was the last time they would see their family, you know. When you left Cuba at that time, you're never coming back. And I saw them crying, so I was the oldest son, and I figured that I shouldn't cry to add to the problem. But of course, there's the whole inner world of what I was feeling myself as I look through the window and see my relatives out there. So some split occurs there, in which some part of me, emotional part of me, is manifesting within myself, but the external part of me is the conciliatory son, trying to make sure that everybody's okay. And that's a very specific example, and that's not necessarily my personality, but it does point to a method of survival, which then, being exiled 3 times, you become quite savvy at managing, where you can exist in a world smoothly without seeming to have any of the stereotypical artist melodramas, while keeping an inner life that is what makes the work.
Keeping an inner life, yeah. It's something that I'm hearing you say is that inner life is something you learn in childhood. It's something that you protect, keep sacred and separate, but also it, in a sense, doesn't even need protecting. It's just that deep inside you, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the reason why there are openings, which I smoothly move through them. But until somebody comes and asks me a question.
Oh, yeah,
and
when they ask you about that.
When they ask me a question, then I can very quickly organize a quick answer. But if the person wants something more than the quick answer, my answer is always, we cannot talk about that here. Because that will mean entering a different territory. So what we're doing here is kind of like a hybrid.
Yeah. I'm glad to be part of the hybrid. But yes, I was at an opening of yours in Beverly Hills, I think, in February of 2022, and I remember the gentleman, I think a gallerist, asking you to hold forth and give a speech about what your art's all about to the assembled throng. And I think you quoted from Eliot. That definitely baffled people. So they, right? Yes, and they were like, okay, well, we don't know anything more than when we started. But I appreciated that moment of, I guess an academic would say opacity, but I'll just say poetic, like negative capability, right? Like, yeah, wait. You were saying, as the artist, don't look to me to tell you what the work is about. Experience it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways people might interpret that as trying to be obscure. I'm just trying to be obscure. But in fact, I was trying to be precise. What I'm trying to avoid, like, in a painting like this, and you ask me, why is a suitcase dripping water? Or what is that? And that kind of translation that is often what people want. Not only does it disservice to the work, it does a disservice to whoever is asking the question. Because if I could take a painting and create like a list of these elements and what they mean, and there you have meaning, then I will do that because it's a lot easier. So sometimes the reason why something might be what I might be appear to be obscure is to maintain the vitality of the discovery of the work without collapsing it into an oversimplified reduction of the work, which is not the work at all. But people sometimes want that. They want this sort of they have been educated, I think, in many ways by the art world to want the caption.
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, there's so many ways that, at least for me, your work is unique now. It's romantic and grandiose in an unapologetic and intimate way in addressing us as viewers with the respect that we don't think we deserve but really do, which is as people who would be spoken to as we might be in a religious context as being special or even sacred beings who demand and might even very much need the kind of magisterial, but again, intimate and personal address of pictures like yours. I find them to be totally at home in church-like settings. And maybe there's something about the mood that your works put people in. I remember I was at that same opening in Beverly Hills. It was like there was some confessional thing happening. Either your paintings were doing it, or me and my sort of gullible, approachable yet distant way. Being an exile myself there, even though I just grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and I was not exiled from anywhere ever. But I think I live that exilic life, and I maybe relate to your lone figures so much, skating on their ponds at midnight and all of these things. But yeah, this woman came up to me and she was like, basically it turned out she's just in town in LA, and she's had spent her life defending criminals. She was telling me this who'd committed dastardly crimes that she knew were guilty. Like, I'm just like looking at Enrique's paintings, and this person's telling me this. And in a way I was grateful, and she was wanting some kind of, what do you say, like absolution or something like that. Or it was a mystical moment of a kind. I think she had a sense, who knows, but she maybe had a sense like this is something a little different here. There's a different kind of honesty in the air, or a different, there's something sanctified or religious in the air in that space. And I don't think I've ever had a conversation initiated by a stranger at an art opening quite like that. Yeah. But it leads me to this idea, which I don't think you'd resist, which is that your work is prophetic in some way. It is prophet-like. Like you're not a painter just to be a painter. You feel that there is some kind of, I don't know, like urgent atmosphere of urgency your work must create for people. It must be generous to the viewer, but require much of those viewers to whom it is generous.
Yeah, you know, when I was younger, I was a physicist. I started as an apprentice for a painter, then I was a physicist because I wanted to make sense of the world. So there was an urgency for me to understand the world because I felt the world didn't make sense to me. I felt that I watched people moving around as if they understood the world. And I felt that I didn't understand it. So I thought first, well, mathematics and physics are the way to go. You know, and there's great beauty and great lessons in physics, but the kinds of questions that I had that became kind of, I didn't have the luxury of postponing them, were questions that seemed so simple. And this is why when people ask questions about their work, coming back to this point, for example, in that projection that just came out, that there was suitcases in a chair. Each one of those suitcases is based on the suitcase that my mother, my brother, and I left Cuba with. 44 pounds was the maximum a family could take without any valuables. And if I give this piece of information, you might think, well, now I understand something more. But to me, it's actually the opposite. If I place that suitcase here in front of us, even though it's so concrete and so matter of fact in some ways, to me, everything about it is unknowable. The more I look at that suitcase, the more arrows come out of it that make the experience of the suitcase more and more puzzling. And what it opens are questions of being, of place, of self. And this is true of all objects. So while in physics you look at all objects with the hope that you can understand it if you think hard enough about them, what I find that as an artist, the more I look at something, the more the mystery grows. Maurice Maeterlinck has a line that I think points to this very well. It says, "The great secret, the only secret, is that all things are secret." And I find that to be very true of my experience of the world. And that's the urgency. The urgency comes from the recognition of the inherent secret of all things and trying to understand the implications.
Yeah, the suitcase is closed, and moreover, it's personal, but it's so generous to others because it presupposes that we don't so much as have secrets, though of course we do, but that we are secrets to ourselves, which is what we forget and even disavow. And no doubt artists are encouraged to strip down every last obscurity in their work, except only the most fashionable ones, to kind of excessively mysterious obscurities, in order to be as clear as possible and as generous as possible. But one could argue that in that clearance, in that kind of, just like sort of paving the way in the name of generosity, one treats viewers and finally the work itself as a kind of flat land. Yeah. So, I want to, we still have a little more time. I want to just think about this. I mean, you seem, maybe this is putting it mildly, but you seem unusual now as an artist. I mean, I have not ever talked to an artist, and I say this with love in my heart, of course, who's quoted Maurice Maeterlinck, or Frost for that matter, never. So there's a lot of connection we have, but I feel, maybe you disagree, but I feel like what you're doing, the emotional address of it, the impatience with intelligence, etc., is rare. Do you agree? And if so, why do you think you're an only one in this regard?
I mean, I don't see it very often, which is not a source of in any way of any pride, but it's a source of quite great deal of isolation.
Totally.
So, and I'm truly confused why it is, because the reason why I need to think of Maeterlinck, or I need to invoke all these things that I invoke, is out of desperation.
Yeah.
So when I see artists so confident with the 5 things they know,
Yeah.
and then that they get the assistance to make the work, because the idea is not only known by them, but it's so well known that it can be transmitted to other people to make it. I feel like in the most generous moments, what I feel is like that must have nothing to do with what I'm involved. And if I could, of what I'm doing, if I could call what I'm doing a different name, which I think about it in a different, I feel in my mind that there's a long history of people who I feel, the constellation of people that I feel responsible to and responsive to their work and to their history and to their life. But that doesn't seem to have very many things in the contemporary world that I feel I fit in. So I often say this expression that people think I don't know what people think of them, but I often say I'm accidentally an artist. But I don't really mean that. I just really mean that I'm accidentally part of the art world. That's what it means. And it's not necessarily a happy accident. It's a.
Yeah, I think you've spoken to me in the past about, I mean, it takes, and you're nice when you say it, but you basically say something like, well, thank you for writing about my work. I feel less isolated, like you feel very isolated. So I think, since as far as I can tell, your work rarely, if ever, attracts a negative review, it's all praiseworthy, yet the praise is often isolated. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I am grateful that it has a life and people acquire it, museums acquire it, and all of that. But it always feels, not always, but all too often, that positive praise has very little to do with what I think is critical in the work. For example, in the work that I'm exhibiting in New York, part of my work is juxtaposed against Velázquez's work. Well, juxtapose your work against Velázquez's work is decide that you're a beginner boxing student and you're going to go and do a demonstration with Muhammad Ali or something like that. And anyone can imagine that would be a fun thing to look at. It underestimates the dangers. Mm-hmm. So for me, the dangers are precisely what I'm interested in tackling in that interaction.
I see, yeah.
But then if somebody comes in and does a review that that waxes poetically over Velasquez and me in some ways that seem positive and easy without being ungrateful for those things. It misses why I spend hours and hours in my studio destroying works and trying to think of how to create an experience that merits that encounter.
Yeah, that a really good critic would encounter the same kind of difficulty that you experience in making the work, or the danger, to use your word. And there would be something at risk there instead of, I don't know, the phrase that comes to my mind would be being smart. But let me ask you this, why do we ask so little of art?
I think I have a sense for it, actually. I think that we ask so little of art because we have, the project of modernity has taught us to expect not so much from art as a whole. I think that there was a time that art was conversant with the ideas that people knew and the realities that people knew. But as art moves itself into a satellite separate from everyday life, the intersection with, if most people are in pain, they go to religion or they go to a therapist, but they don't typically go to art. And if you want to sort of have a great ethical, emotional encounter, you read the Brother Karamazov, but you don't go to a museum. It's a little bit of the way our society have been indoctrinated in the idea that art functions as a, at best, I think, and this is generalization, I'm not, there are individuals that are obviously like yourself who have a different relationship, but I think overall people go to museums to complete some sort of aspect of culture. People come to my studio in a bus when they go to other museums and other studios, and they don't realize that is very much like, this will sound like an exaggeration, I hope you challenge me on it, but it would be like you get on a bus and you visit a mosque and you visit a Catholic church and then you visit a synagogue and then you visit a satanic cult, and each one of those is like, oh, look how people practice religion. But there's no way that at that level of observational distance could you understand what it means to be in any one of those religious experiences. So imagine for me, this is life or death. This is the reason why I have sacrificed so much. So when you arrive at the studio with a sandwich, after coming from a completely opposing, not just opposing look, a completely opposing way of being in the world as an artist, it's very difficult to then expect more from art when that is the kind of moral flexibility that we can have with it.
Yeah, it's sort of in addition to the historical forces that you describe, wherein art has been sort of farmed out to entertainment and didacticisms of different kinds. I think of our own fortress-like resistance to being opened up by things, or when it even does happen, we are taught to disavow that as a dangerous and weird, embarrassing, unhelpful, unproductive, non-transactional phenomenon. And, as against that is, I guess the poet and the artist must always consider themselves to be in perpetual exile because it's a rolling tide that could never be resisted. But, you know, I still, I'm full of admiration for the way that you do resist, and there are people, maybe it's every one of us in this room, in fact, who at one time or another, or perhaps more often than that, experience exactly the thrall and the kind of shivering intensity that your work, as you describe in a life and death sense, brings. And, you know, I'm remembering when my daughters were little, we, in the elementary school here in Palo Alto, we did like a raffle for thing, and one, you know, you do a kind of raffle to raise money, and one was like, well, the poetry reading, and at so-and-so's house, everyone bring a poem. And I, you know, condescendingly probably thought, well, I'll steal this show at least, like, you know. Anyway, I thought, one of the people there, one of the other parents, read this poem. I forget what it was about, but she was truly shaken by reading the poem, and not in a quote unquote emotional way, if you know what I mean. It wasn't sort of today it's raining and I feel sad. It was like a difficult poem that she was not performing even, she was speaking it. There's a difference between speaking and performing. And you know, she was just kind of shuddering afterwards, but in a intensity of her own. And I thought, I was in awe because, wow, I had a lot to learn from her. And I guess my point is that intensity is out there all the time. Everyone is a damn lightning rod, whether they realize it or not. And Stanford is prolific in, as other institutions are, in making sure we let go of that kind of intensity. But it can't really be eradicated either. I don't know. Let me ask a last question before we do a couple of questions from the audience here, which is just about hopeless, helpless, hope and hopelessness. I mean, obviously you keep doing what you're doing, and I don't imagine you feel that you're putting your work out there into a void. But I don't imagine that you have some optimistic vision of a regenerated society as a result of your art or any kind of art. So how do you manage the ratios of despair and exhilaration that come with being an artist?
I think when I was younger, I used to have a lot of problems with this. But over time, I came to the realization that art is really not about numbers, even though arts organizations and museums and look at turnstiles and how many people come to see the exhibition. That is really not about numbers. I mean, like, I would be satisfied if one person was moved by my work. If more than that, a few, that's incredible. And that comes from the recognition of my own experience. When I am moved, say, by Boris Pasternak, I don't consult how many other people are moved by it. I'm safe, I've been saved, reoriented, guided, returned to the world with a new vitality by so many works of art, poems, novels, that I can use myself as a measurement, just one person. These people transform me, and that is enough. And some of them, like say, Can Giuseppe da Lampedusa with the leopard, it was not somebody that anybody at any moment in time wanted to publish this book. So,
right.
So in that way, as a number, it was a number of zero. And yet for me, it generated so much so much inside me, and I did works about Lampedusa and so on, and like that, I can list many, many. So for that reason, it's not about numbers, and what I'm hoping is always for that communion with one of you, with couple, that makes me feel less alone, have a sense of companionship in some manner, and I have confirmation that I get letters, and it never has to be, it doesn't have to be I got a million letters or 1,000 letters, just one
Yeah.
heartfelt letter or even our relationship. And this is why I said these things to you. It made me feel that even though you're here and I'm hundreds of miles away doing my work, this conversation is ongoing in a manner, and that's why I send you the works that I did for Cuba, because I want you to see what I'm doing, and you tell me something, and that makes the experience less isolated.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. I am much heartened by it, that it's really just about individual connections and the humility of that, but also the intensity and the kind of non-negotiable truth of that too, those moments of connection, as what we live for. I'm going to stop now, and then we have questions, or we have microphones available. We have time for 2 or maybe 3 questions. This one right here, yeah.
Thank you so much for being with us here today. What really resonated with me was when you were speaking about this idea of the split when you were on the plane and how you split yourself in that situation. And I think some people find themselves in a situation like that in life just by chance. And I was wondering, what's your opinion on people who don't live life or haven't had, I guess, an opportunity to live life as intensely or through intense situations like that? Are you able to somehow manufacture this split for these type of people, and how do we express the urgency to experience something like that and be able to create that inner dialogue that artists have?
Thank you for the question. The present is always urgent. I mean, like, the notion that we're numb or that there's boredom, the intensity is always there. The problem, I think, is that through the conditioning, which I'm not going to go into it, but most of you know, there are many different kinds of conditioning. We have been sort of numbed out, or make the reality too dull for us. We need sort of jolts of electricity for us to see something for what it is. So I think you do not need to be in the plane, be in exile, to recognize the urgency of the present moment. You just need to wake up to it. And the question is, what wakes you up? And I think for each of us, like if I were to say, well, what is perhaps one of the most important missions for each of us, is to figure out what is it that wakes us up to the present moment, to reality as it is. And once you're awakened to it, all of it is urgent. All of it is too much. And we cannot exist when you go and get bagels or taking a class in that level of intensity, and that's the split in some ways. You can be present, but it's difficult to function in the conventional, mundane, everyday life, but that doesn't mean that it's taken away. It exists there. But I think we're incredibly patient to our detriment with our numbness. And I think that we just go around and distract ourselves and wonder, why is it that our lives don't seem richer? And to me, it's like, considering how brief we're here, how short this whole thing is, like, now is the moment. There's no 5 minutes from now. Now is the moment to waking up. And you say, well, how do I do it? And my answer is always, try everything, that you can. And of course, there are many methodologies, but I think if the moment is there and not to be squandered.
Thank you.
Another question?
Hi, thank you. I was just curious what an aspiration of yours is.
I'm smiling because I'm trying to figure out which direction I go with this. So, I mean, there are so to answer that question as honestly as I can answer it, I live my life in the dual thing before trying to have not a lot of aspirations, and take life as it unfolds, as meaningfully as I can, and the aspirations sort of, as people describe them, come from that. Yet I have some aspirations that have mostly to do with family. I find myself in that area, It's difficult not to have aspirations when you have kids. But other than that, I don't set myself goals. I did when I was younger, but not anymore. I don't imagine that I will do this show or I will do this thing this way, or I don't have that. And it's connected to the previous question. I think it's connected to the present moment, of trying to be awakened to it and taken as it is without any of my aspirations, preconceptions, hopes, fears, because I find that all those things get in the way of the moment. They sort of block it. And then I read the moment through my aspirations. And then it's no longer the moment.
One last question. Yes, right over here.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and speaking to us. I'm really interested in what you had to say about the art market, and I was curious how being signed to UTA, if it changed your art practice or it changed how you viewed your career.
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of contradiction of, you can do a whole other talk about contradictions of being an artist. So UTA, for those of you who don't know what it is one of the big agencies of United Talent Agencies, that represents actors and many creatives people. So I'm represented by the agency as well as the art thing. And I think that I think I can have a very sort of hard, since I was younger, a very hard partitions between different parts of my life. When I'm at UTA, I never think of any of the things that I talked about today. And when I am in my studio, I never think of UTA. They just and so, I think we're Stanford, I think many of you here understand what I mean, in the sense that there's a worldly elements. You get into a good school by doing certain worldly things, like studying. and things like that. But then there are other things that need to be preserved in their sacredness of sorts. And to support them, like I am very fortunate that my work has a reception in the world so that it allows me to do my work and to take on projects and to be offered opportunities that I would never be offered otherwise. That's one of the arguments to have a successful career. I'm sure that I would have found other ways to have satisfactory work, but I'm very grateful to have opportunities that allow me to stretch myself and find ways to meet those opportunities. So, and for example, I wrote a novel that UTA wants to shop out into it. So that's great for me. But at the end, when it comes back, whatever is offered, I use the same criteria of what serves the work. So you're right. I'm glad that you bring this up, because these contradictions can be severe, and at times you find yourselves in very strange places because of them. But I think that the way I resolve them, maybe conveniently, and I could attack myself for it, is by creating these very, very hard lines. I also, as an academic, as a professor, that's another way that I have to have a hard line in there, because teaching and engaging in academia requires a whole different way of looking at the world than the work itself of being an artist.
Thank you, Enrique. Thank you all, and I appreciate it. Have a good evening. Okay.